Ladies and gentlemen, Control is one of the best games that I've played in a long time. Control is one of those rare games that just has everything I'm looking for in a game. I haven't felt such a deep connection to a game world where merely its mechanics are so natural and effortless and feel so entwined with every aspect of the game world, where the rules of the universe are so weird yet easy to comprehend, where merely its art direction can be enough to suck you in and make you want to explore every wall and corridor of this dense, layered, engrossing, shape-shifting, Cold War Secret Service inspired world. Which is why I wanted to make this video, to take a deep dive into Control's main strength as a video game, something I believe all video games should strive for, and that is how it manages to build a connection with the player to the point where you're so immersed, you almost forget you're playing a video game at certain points. How Control is a master at building player connection. Now, writing mystery fiction, or hell, any kind of fiction, can be extremely challenging, especially in the video game format, because you're not just having to find the balance between telling a narrative and creating a fun gameplay experience, but so often it can be hard to find ways of infusing the gameplay mechanics and gameplay experience with the narrative you're trying to tell, because often they can be at war with one another and don't manage to tether themselves to the player's wants and goals. Therefore, you can end up with a game that has great ideas and looks fun to play, but ends up having lots of intrusive elements that feel like they don't really fit within the wider context of the narrative. The dreaded ludonarrative dissonance. I'll use Assassin's Creed to illustrate my point here. In Assassin's Creed, you have the Animus. Now, in story terms, this mechanism functions as a way to introduce the core concept of the narrative, which is about a man experiencing the life of his ancestor. But here's where things get interesting. The Animus also functions as a means of gameplay, because what it's doing is infusing the ideas of a health bar, a minimap, loading times, save files, menus, and even glitches with a sense of narrative purpose. Even elements like the Monteriggioni Villa in the second game serving as not just a boring, generic base of operations, but its own economy to upgrade, which merges with the narrative drive to upgrade your assassin abilities and restore a sense of hope for Ezio's family, with the Animus allowing you to track your progress while at the same time serving the narrative purpose of progressing the story. Yes, it's still a video game, but you feel so immersed in the world because of how the developers have gone about weaving the mechanical and narrative elements into a cohesive whole. The great storytelling and writing is really just an added bonus. Now, Control doesn't have the luxury of having a literal device to explain the game's narrative and mechanical choices. Instead, Control builds an immersive player connection through deliberate writing choices, drawing the line between the player's motivations and the character's motivations, while at the same time weaving them together and through its detailed world and how it interacts with its protagonist, Jesse Faden. That does sound a bit complicated, so let me explain. In video games, the controllable character functions as a conduit that enables the player to take control of a fantasy, often a power fantasy, and guide that character to complete objectives and progress through a narrative. Control is written from Jesse's first-person point of view, but talks to an unknown entity throughout the entirety of the game called Polaris. The way she speaks to this entity is the most deliberate and vocal way the game builds that connection with the player, and is the first instance of the game drawing the line between player motivation and character motivation, because here's the thing. The player is not the character. By making this distinction clear from the get-go, it further invests us into the world without having to try so hard to make you feel like the character. Control eases us in and paces its progression and story out perfectly. See, we the audience have brought this game on the premise that it is a third-person action game set in a fascinating world of espionage and weird interdimensional happenings, but our character Jesse doesn't have any knowledge of our own personal activities or whereabouts. Or does she? Bruh. Oh my god! See, we the player use our gaming console and the game itself as a gateway, if you will, between the playable character and us the person playing the game. One could even say that much like the slide projector we see in the gaming console we use is a window into another world. Jesse is by definition the vessel that allows us to play the game, but consistently the game will pause to hear her inner dialogue with questions like,
"Why did you bring me here?"
It grounds the gameplay and makes the experience feel more personal, more introspective. After all, why are you deciding to play a video game in the first place if not to seek answers about a story, explore a world, or just shoot bad guys? Whatever it is you play games for, of course. Now, obviously people may have bought the game simply to experience the story, but it works for whatever reason you bought the game for, because you're being directly confronted by the conduit and being asked, why did you bring me here? Polaris is the narrative window into a game that invites the player to be as much a part of this journey as Jesse, even if the symbiotic relationship between Polaris and the player isn't explicitly stated by the game's writing, but rather very cleverly implied. The game works because it is acutely aware that you and Jesse are entirely separate, but serve an equally important function within the narrative confines of the game's story and world. The game has immediately taken that step to acknowledge the important role that you, the player, play in the progression of the narrative. Our motivations and Jesse's go hand in hand on a gameplay level because you get to exude the control of the gameplay, which is predominantly what we play games for. We don't have control over her narrative, yet we are controlling her every step of the way and invest in the journey more because of how the protagonist brings into question our own motivations as much as we put into question hers. We have as many questions about this world as the protagonist. Therefore, it is easier to be immersed and buy into the game's world and lore. The game has earned our trust through strong writing and by recognizing the role the player has in pushing the game forward. And this is also why we managed to form such a strong connection with the world. As mentioned before, the game uses Polaris as a narrative mechanism that guides Jesse through this strange world, and for all intent and purposes, this entity could literally be the embodiment of the player guiding Jesse towards the end goal. It functions in a narrative sense to provide the player with insight into Jesse's mindset, while in fact still retaining the mysterious nature of the story, but also as a way of communicating the necessary information to the player without coming off as intrusive. And this is how I feel a game should make a player feel, that though they have no control over the tale that unfolds, they have an important part to play in the progression of that story nonetheless. To put it all in basic terms, the developers have clearly thought through how to tether the mechanical elements of a video game and the narrative of the game being told to the needs of the player in a way that is so seamless and done with such care that you don't even really notice it. You're just along for the ride. To give you an example of this in another game, let's examine The Last of Us, arguably one of the best games of the last decade. The game doesn't initially start out with you playing as Joel, but rather as his daughter Sarah. Now, think about what this does for a moment. You might be saying, it sets the scene. Yes. That it sets up Joel's motivations and his character arc. Yes, correct. And functions as a window into this world to put you in the perspective of someone waking up and finding out the world is falling apart. Yes, yes, and yes! But what else does this do? Joel throughout the game is never on his own. He's always got a companion by his side, something I recently noticed replaying this game. The situation we were put in the beginning is a scenario that we have no control over, even though we were controlling the very person Joel cared about most and eventually played as Joel to carry Sarah to safety. We had that control of the person we were initially playing as and grew an attachment to stripped away from us. Sarah's death, unfortunately, was an inevitable ticking time bomb, which is why you feel this intense attachment to Joel and heightened sense of tension throughout the game whenever Ellie is in danger, because while you are ultimately the one controlling him, it gives you, the player, a sense of responsibility and power in how you go about helping him protect his allies, and it's done so well that without even realizing it, you and Joel form an incredibly natural symbiotic relationship of player and character, which is why I started to sweat and feel my palms shake when we played as Ellie in the latter half of the game, because I was frightened that, like Sarah at the beginning, Joel and I, the player, would lose something we had grown to care about, not just at the beginning of the game, but throughout the entirety of the story, which is brilliant storytelling and a showcase for the potential that games have to tell truly powerful stories. And all of this extends to gameplay as well. In an interview with game director Mikhail Kasurnin, he talks about how they went about the director's weapon we see in the game.
Now, similar to the crazy powers, we saw she had a crazy gun. It looked like breathing, actually, almost. Oh, is that like a secret? Am I not supposed to... Is that like a big key plot thing that breathes?
The gun. Okay, so a huge part of the the kind of aesthetic pillar, I would say, for the game is this a shape-shifting nature of things. Like you see it in the building, and you see it in the gun and so on. So it's a language that we're using.
Control is a great example of how narrative language and gameplay functionality go hand in hand and makes the world a true character within the game that interacts with our protagonist. And there are countless examples of this throughout the game. Features such as upgrading your gun feel so immersive because from a story perspective, it is a literal shape-shifting gun, but also a strong visual reminder of the role Jesse embodies as the director. So upgrading it with new features, mods, and characteristics feels like a natural metaphor for what the director's weapon represents. The control points that Polaris guides you towards, where we cleanse the hiss virus, serving not just as fast travel points but placing emphasis on the fact that they are rooted within the game's lore and world, with the obvious example being that Jesse is the only one to be able to hop between them at any given time. The objects of power serving as not just generic ways of being able to use telekinetic powers to hurl objects towards people, but items that the board appoints you to look after the Bureau. The astral plane in Ocean's View Motel operating as direct routes between one area and another, and how the board inducts a new director into the Bureau, and how they both connect to various gameplay features such as learning new abilities and solving puzzles. This weird, fascinating light switch that you have to pull 3 times before advancing to a new area that freaked me out not once, not twice, but 3 frickin' times. Even the simple explanation of why we are playing this game in the first place. The board needs a director. Do you see where I'm going with this? Everything has been carefully thought about with a clear purpose and not just being chucked in because fast travel points or tutorials are just things you have to include in a video game. They didn't even have to go this extra of a mile, but they did, and that makes me love this game so much more. Because of this, nothing in the game feels extraneous or pointless. It never feels like a chore. It feels like a believable world that feels alive, jaw-dropping, and even frightening. As mentioned before, the natural fusion of gameplay with the design of the world and the drawing of the line between player and character, yet making them one and the same, brings the world to life and makes the world its own dangerous character, ever changing and constantly shifting, leaving no room for any intrusive elements to be present. Even the generic training segments are given narrative purpose by serving as the new director's induction into the role and a way to learn the responsibilities of being the director. While Remedy may not have the luxury of using a device such as the Animus to explain away the HUD, because of the great writing, even the HUD feels natural by virtue of your character being the director of this bureau and having direct knowledge of the layout of the area. I actually think they could have been even more restrained and not given you the minimap at all until you got inducted into the new role as director. And even then, the HUD is incredibly minimal and restrained, something Remedy is well known for. There's zero hand-holding, and yet I find myself knowing what it is I need to do and where I need to go. Accessible, yet rewarding of your time. Control, even with all this being said, is still not perfect. In fact, the lack of real enemy variety, only one save file, some outright horrendous slowdowns during big battles, side quests with incredible boss battles that should really be in the main story, or the fact that once we finally meet Jesse's brother Dylan, it is rather underwhelming. These are all sentiments I agree with. The lack of explanation on many of the game's mysterious elements may frustrate some, but it works entirely in the game's favour. No, I think there's a core issue with the game that many people may overlook, and it is something that could have elevated Control's story in a much larger yet more personal way, something that I hope maybe even the sequel can delve into and expand on. Throughout the game, we barely learn much about Jessie outside of some admittedly compelling collectibles scattered with bits and pieces about her and Dylan's past as children. Which is why I found it quite telling and interesting that towards the end of the game, when Jessie gets taken over by the Hiss, the virus that has infected the entire bureau, that her worst nightmare, her horrifying vision it seems, is working a boring office job delivering mail, collecting coffee cups and filing paperwork. Is this meant to imply a more nuanced feminist undercurrent to the game? The idea that women can only be good in boring corporate assistant roles, and Jessie fears of succumbing to that lifestyle? Is it about the lack of control a woman feels she has in a highly corporatized world? Or the fact that anyone's biggest fear could be feeling like they are never good enough and are simply becoming a cog in a machine just to maintain control of their life? Or that the world has become so mechanical to the point that we all start to feel like we're stripped of any form of individuality? Do you see where I'm getting at here? Because we don't learn much about Jessie, and much of the story places emphasis on her efforts to find Dylan and Polaris, the story and characters characters feel a little one-dimensional and don't feel like they have anywhere else to go, even if they are admittedly very likeable, with a big shout out to Matthew Peretta, who plays Dr. Darling. His performance is so good and weird that he ended up being my favourite character throughout this game. As I was saying though, so much more could have been done with this story. Like, think of what that office scene alone implies and how it could have brought the game up a level from the 9 out of 10 that I give it to the 10 out of 10 that it could have been if it had maybe incorporated some of its more nuanced ideas throughout the grander narrative. All that aside though, Control is simply a stunning game. Not once did I ever have any of those so-called immersion-breaking moments. It is a game that is made with such love, care, and passion. Its slick performance, polished controls, the perfect structuring of missions, the level of detail in it all, the use of colours that just ooze atmosphere, the haunting soundtrack, the mystery in every corner and crevice, and the fascinating lore that just has me pining to pick up every classified file, every audio recording, every film recording. It's all just brilliant. For a AAA title, the game was made with a relatively small budget by industry standards, but it is currently selling well, and I hope that if they do make a sequel that they take their time with it, don't rush it out, and continue to build on what they already have. Even with some minor issues, Remedy truly has something special here, and with a bit of optimism on my end, this could actually end up being what I hoped Assassin's Creed could have been, instead of what it has turned into. Control is what games truly can be when developers really put their mind to it. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing, as well as turning on the notification bell so you don't miss a video. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Instagram, as it all contributes to helping me learn and grow and spreading the good word of my channel. But most importantly, just makes me want to get a motorcycle because
riding a motorcycle is like being a puppy, isn't it?
Some kind of time.